people should and can make a difference. And what Amnesty does is fundamentally about holding those in power accountable for making sure that human rights are protected and promoted across the world.
We have more than 3 million members in 150 countries, and we mobilize people around the world to work on behalf of those who have been denied the most basic human rights. Amnesty International has helped to free tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience. We've shut down torture and execution chambers. We've carried out campaigns that have done away with tyranny and oppression. We've literally changed the face of our world.
In today's world, it's very common to hear people talk about human rights.
Deliberately causing a human being to nearly drown over and over again is a form of torture.
But 50 years ago, you almost never heard the words human rights used by anybody. And back then, nobody had the idea that there was anything a citizen could do about human rights violations taking place in some other country. But that was the crazy idea with which Amnesty International was born.
Peter was an English lawyer, and he was somebody who was very much moved by injustice.
And he knew that the outrage at injustice that he felt was something that he shared with all humanity.
So in 1961, he wrote an article which appeared in the London Sunday newspaper, The Observer, in which he wrote about the plight of prisoners of conscience, those who were imprisoned because they'd expressed their opinions or their religious beliefs.
And he said these patterns were everywhere. In the United States, you had the suppression of the civil rights activists. Throughout the Soviet Union, you had the Gulag. And throughout so many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, you had citizens being oppressed by the still existing colonial powers or by the new governments that come along. So he really said, there's a global pattern here, and we have to tackle it impartially and regardless of politics. After Benenson had launched his appeal, all kinds of people came forward and offered their help. It was like a spontaneous kind of volunteer army.
These Amnesty members are a mixed bunch: a secretary, a teacher, a nurse, an electrician, and a social worker.
And in a way, the basic idea of Amnesty in those days was matching people up. On the one hand, you had someone who was in prison, languishing, ill-treated, and apparently without any hope. On the other side of the world, you had people who wanted to get that person out.
It was really in the beginning of the 1960s that we developed postcard campaigns.
At the time, people thought, you know, this is just writing letters to dictators. I mean, how absurd can you get?
But the whole idea was to throw as much dust into the system of governments that they just couldn't continue to function as usual.
How was it possible that, being a political prisoner and not a high government official, that I should have so many friends in so many parts of the world? And finally, when the letters went into thousands, the president had no alternative but to set us free.
To know that there is somebody who cares, so there is a group of Amnesty International, that some students are sitting and writing letters on our behalf, and they're trying to make us not forgotten, that was extremely important as a support. It created tremendous uplift.
Members of Amnesty have written countless letters on behalf of 30,000 prisoners of conscience. Of these, 25,000 cases have now been closed.
It was clear that Amnesty International was a brilliant idea, but it had to become far better known.
So in the beginning of the 70s, we started to build up a professional, paid research department. Our primary mission was to document the cases of prisoners of conscience and instances of torture.
I looked under tables, I tried to find the key to 50 million fables. They call me the seeker.
Let me see here. This is, yes, this is a very important one. One way of carrying the message would be to brief journalists. The significant thing about this case, like many others, is that when he was arrested, there were no charges against him, and yet he was subjected to prolonged torture. We wanted to steal the headlines.
I won't get what I'm after till the day I die.
And something started to happen to world leaders that absolutely had never happened before in history, which is that when they arrived somewhere with all their entourage, you know, for trade talks or whatever, a journalist would sit there and ask them about people in their country who had had their fingernails pulled out.
I'm a seeker, I'm a really desperate man.
And this drove them nuts. We were so widely denounced that we published a wonderful little booklet in which we were able to quote denunciations from world leaders from all over the globe. They felt the need sometimes to stand up in front of the whole of the United Nations and denounce us. Then we knew we were really doing our job properly.
I won't get what I'm after till the day I die.
By the time Amnesty International won the Nobel Prize in 1977, it had established that this kind of action by ordinary people could make a huge difference in the lives of millions of people, often very far away from the people who were taking the action.
The award of the prize is a most welcome support for our efforts on behalf of prisoners of conscience and against torture and the death penalty.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom.
I think musicians and artists in general have always got Amnesty because they have always made the connection between freedom of expression and what Amnesty stands for.
Ever since I was a young boy, I played the silver ball. From Soho down to Brighton, I must have played them all. Any day now, anyway now, rock and roll. Someone's gonna hurt you like you hurt me.
So in the 1980s, the director of Amnesty USA, Jack Healy, a very inspirational and moving leader, decided to amplify the message of Amnesty International through music. And he had a very fortunate encounter with a very young Irish band called U2. That led to the Conspiracy of Hope tour across the United States in June of 1986.
You had enough of Beirut. You had enough of Nicaragua. Of Belfast. And after me, sing, no more!
Within 3 months of that tour, the membership of Amnesty International in the US had doubled. There'd never been such exponential growth in Amnesty before. And it really put Amnesty on the map, certainly in the United States. But nobody had ever toured globally on a human rights issue before. So in 1988, the Human Rights Now tour was launched. You had Bruce Springsteen, Sting, Peter Gabriel, Youssou N'Dour and Tracy Chapman traveling to the four corners in the world.
I'm here for Amnesty International and to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights.
They played in places that Amnesty had never been heard of, places that had never heard the message of human rights. Zimbabwe, they played in India, we played in Budapest in Hungary for the first time, they played in Argentina. So this was something that had never been dreamed of by human rights organizations before.
When you look at this Declaration of Human Rights, every government of the world fails to enact these principles and these ideals.
We have made progress, but there's no reason to feel complacent.
Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight.
One of Amnesty International's greatest successes has been to make human rights something that's central to the discussion about international affairs and about domestic affairs. But here's the interesting thing about changing the world. As you try to change the world, you find out that you're also changing yourself.
Left bank, I'm waiting for someone to be my friend.
Amnesty started out thinking the most important thing was to get people out of prison who were there for their nonviolent expression of their beliefs, prisoners of conscience. That's all it was going to focus on. And then as governments got more sophisticated, they realized rather than put people in prison so Amnesty could write letters on their behalf, let's get rid of people before they ever get to prison. Let's disappear people. Let's kill people. So Amnesty began to be not just a prisoner organization, but an organization that against violence of all kinds. In every case, what Amnesty was doing was simply following the fight for dignity and freedom wherever it took it.
And today, in 2011, we're focusing our attention on a wide range of initiatives: torture, violence against women, dignity for the poor, and an end to the death penalty.
All of these issues which we are trying to tackle, every one of those things are happening because of the choices that governments and authorities are making. So it's Amnesty's job to put pressure on governments and change their policies, change their actions.
It is in our hands to build another world.
Amnesty is about human dignity. Nobody's safe if there is no freedom and democracy and justice. And never underestimate what a determined few individuals can do.
50 years ago, people responded to the challenge of their time. We're in another time right now when we really need a mobilization of people as never before. We need now to seize this time and make sure that we're responding to the people around the world who are looking for hope. Because the only people you can count on to advance human rights are human beings. And that's us. If we don't do it, nobody else will do it. So we need to meet our responsibilities and really do our part to carry the human race forward and not backward.
I'm reminded of the words of a 16th century man sentenced to death by burning. Be of good comfort. We have today lit such a candle as shall never be put out.